The field of STS often looks at places where what we think we need socially and emotionally shifts in response to available technologies. Today, we're looking at an interesting case study that will approach from the other direction. Technologies that developed in response to emotional needs and the structures of society that surround those needs. I'm Chelsea Clary of Clemson University, and this is a Science, Technology, and Society 1010 lecture on the technologies of Victorian mourning, special for spooky season. So mourning, with a U, refers to the process of grieving someone who has passed away. In the 19th century, that is decades that start with an 18, making this process publicly recognizable was a way of carving out space for grief in a society where death usually happened at home. We'll focus primarily on mourning traditions in the US here, but much of the information also applies to the UK and the Commonwealth. So, if you live in a society like the 19th century United States, where infant and child mortality is fairly high, where you're likely to be responsible for preparing your own relatives for burial at some point, and where having the free time to grieve publicly and privately is an important class marker, death becomes a big deal. And there are both religious and romantic drives to keep it present in your mind too. So what technologies become a part of your societal approach to mourning the dead? During the 19th century, practically everyone encountered dead bodies at some point. What you're seeing here is an illustration of a Victorian coffin, late Victorian. Interesting side vocabulary note, the little toe squeezer shape, which is wider at the shoulders, is called a coffin. It's a casket if it's rectangular and has a hinged lid. So now you know. But this fairly elaborate coffin with the side handles for pallbearers would have to come into the home. People were prepared for burial, generally by the female members of their family. If no one was available to do it, then a school teacher, a pastor's wife, sometimes the mistress of an upper class home might be asked to dress someone for burial. Generally, if you are the corpse in question, you would be bathed, dressed in your best clothes, surrounded by flowers, which are both symbolic and also the scent of them helps cover the scent of decay, because you're not exactly in a refrigerator, you're probably in your family's best sitting room. Someone would sit up with you, generally, keep vigil. Curtains would be drawn, mirrors would be covered. This is partly to signal that there is grief going on in the home, and partly to help keep the room cool. So you'd be laid out in your coffin. You would have a speedy funeral because they need to get you in the ground before you start to stink. And then you would be carried out the door. You will notice in homes of this era, if they're freestanding, they almost always have a very wide door because you need to be able to get pallbearers on either side of a coffin through that door. Now, what happens if you are a family member of someone who has died? What happens is you go into mourning, which is a sartorial clothing and presentation way of showing that you have recently lost someone. And this serves an interesting purpose in stopping people from pestering you if you're unhappy about a recent death. So it's an important social marker of you should not be bugging me right now, particularly if you are a widow in deep mourning, which we'll get to in a second. The scene in Gone with the Wind where Rhett approaches Scarlett shortly after Ashley's death at a dance is improper, not just because they're not terribly proper people, but also she's still in mourning. So there's no way in hell he should be making a romantic approach to her. It's very, very rude. So if you're a widow, the first stage is everything is black. Ideally, your clothing isn't shiny or reflective of the light. So you would often use fabrics which are called crepe and bombazine, because they're not reflective, they're matte. And you can see that in the photograph of the woman there on the right. Her skirt doesn't reflect light. The woman on the left perhaps dyed an existing dress, because you have to have this funeral quickly and you can't not be dressed in mourning for your husband's funeral. You just can't. So this was probably a dress in some color that then got dropped in a black dye bath. When there were a lot of deaths going on all at once, you could smell that a lot of people were preparing their mourning clothes. So you'll find references in Civil War era travelogues to towns that stink of dye pots to indicate that there are a lot of very recent widows there who just got the news. Unfortunately, chemical dyes become available only partway through the 19th century. The first one that was really widely available was this amazing deep magenta that everybody loved, and it was right around this era. Black is a really difficult color to achieve with natural dyes, though. So, especially if you need your clothing to actually last, because the harsh chemicals are a problem. The best way to do it for most people was to throw it in a really deep green and leave it there until it looked basically black. Unfortunately, the best way to get deep green dye at this time is to boil it in arsenic. The color in question was called Scheele's green. If you don't go all the way to black, you can get a really beautiful emerald, which was very popular for wallpaper, particularly nursery wallpaper. See also why infant mortality was so high. But if you go all the way to black, the arsenic is still in the fabric. And arsenic is actually more toxic absorbed through the skin than taken by mouth. So a woman who has suddenly lost her husband and has to go into deep mourning has dumped all her clothing in arsenic, including the gloves on her hands and the veil over her face. So she's not just absorbing it through her skin, she's inhaling it. Sometimes when you hear about a Victorian widow growing pale and thin and wasting away from a broken heart, she's actually died of arsenic poisoning. And yes, a Scheele's green dyed dress has enough arsenic in it to kill several people to this day. Museums have to be very careful about handling them. Now, if you're not married, you go into full mourning. Here on the left is a woman who's probably given the veil. She's come out of deep mourning and gone into full mourning for her husband. You'll notice she's also got stationery with a black edge there held in her lap, but still full black. It's allowed to be a little shiny. On the right is a photograph of the daughters of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in full mourning for their father. You'll notice that the littlest girl couldn't hold still for the photo, so she's slightly blurry. But a lot of the formal mourning traditions were actually set by Queen Victoria after the death of Albert, who she loved very much. And she essentially went into mourning for the rest of her life. Interestingly, you can't attend a wedding in mourning. It's bad luck. So when each of her kids got married, she would put off mourning for a day and then go right back into it the next day. This even applied if you were the bride. So let's say you had just lost your husband and you have to get married right away, probably to his brother. That was pretty common at the time. You would have the funeral, put off your deep mourning, be a lovely bride for a day, and then go back into mourning. The other interesting thing about weddings and mourning is that women, you will notice all the pictures so far are of women, are responsible for mourning on behalf of their husbands' families. So let's say a man loses his wife and needs to remarry quickly, possibly to his wife's younger sister. Again, really common because there's already a relationship with the kids. Or, you know, just someone else. He could marry, the kids have a new mom, and then she has to go into deep mourning as though she were mourning for a spouse because she has to mourn on behalf of her family. This is an interesting example of the way that women become responsible for the application of technologies according to society, which, you know, is a general term, but there you go. In the same way that, say, a washing machine makes it suddenly, okay, mom has to wash the family's clothes every day, the technology to dye all your clothes black and go into mourning is now the responsibility of mom in a family. So interesting ways that technologies affect different social groups differently. So that's our second phase, full mourning. Here's another example. And interesting in this shot, it's possible they faded differently, but it's more probable that we're seeing different fabrics that took dye differently. Excuse me. Because not everything absorbs the same way. Not everything can be used with the same mordant, which is a substance used to convince the fibers of the fabric that they want to hang on to those pigments. But if you're just chucking everything into a dye bath, there you go. After full mourning comes half mourning. You're now allowed to wear white, gray, and interestingly enough, purple. Usually still with black trim. And you can start introducing jewelry at this stage, as long as it's not too shiny. And you're allowed to look like you're kind of maybe thinking about having fun. But it's still not really socially acceptable to look too happy when you're in mourning. And again, this serves both the purpose of don't talk to me, I'm in mourning. Don't expect me to put up with romantic advances, I'm in mourning, but also restricts the wearer. So, which for men, full mourning is the black, and then half mourning's a black armband, usually. And there are certain relationships, like for a second cousin, you only have to go into half mourning for 3 months. There were charts about this. It got ridiculously granular. More half mourning examples. Here we see that nice soft purple. And that is a classic Civil War era dress, by the way. The ones on the right in the fashion plate are later. Portrait of someone in half mourning. Here's a fashion plate and a reenactor wearing half mourning. That's actually my wife in the dress there. Yes, I am very lucky, but was doing it for a Dickensian festival and applied all of that ribbon by hand. Now, if you're a little kid, you're less likely for people to be particularly upset about you having some shiny or light fabric. Um, the young girl on the left is in full mourning, probably for her father who's in the photo. And the child here on the right is also in mourning, but you'll notice just little black armbands over a white dress. The 19th century was really the heyday of children are innocent. So it kind of bugged people sometimes to dress children in full black mourning. So white would be used as a full mourning color. Interestingly, the further south you go, the more likely that it would have been acceptable for a widow to mourn in all white with a veil. This probably has something to do with heat and humidity. But for instance, in Bermuda, widows customarily wore all white with a white veil. Now, when you start being allowed to wear jewelry again, you would at first choose things that were black and not too shiny. You might have jet, which is a type of attractive coal that you can carve. Most of it, incidentally, comes from Whitby, which is the town that features in the novel Dracula. You can still buy Whitby jet jewelry. Most of it's vampire themed now, funny enough. You could also wear black rubber. Because it didn't have a lot of sheen. You'll also see obsidian and onyx sometimes, but that's somewhat less common. Black enamel over precious metals, as you're seeing here on the upper right, was reasonably common, but you wouldn't necessarily wear that during mourning. You'd wear that as remembrance. Memento mori, the Latin phrase that means remember you will die, is often the description used for that jewelry. You can tell a piece that's mourning a specific person if they've got motifs like oak leaves and acorns, indicates age and wisdom. If they've got funeral urns, usually kind of a Grecian style, because that was a very common thing to put on tombstones. Or if they've got weeping willow trees, and sometimes cedars too. Now, here's another type of remembrance jewelry that was extremely common during the Victorian era. This was customarily crafted by women at home, sometimes from their own materials. I'm letting you look for a minute. And while you look, I'll say again, look at that precious metal and then black enamel. The material used to make that jewelry is hair. Human hair can be made into a variety of shapes. The technique used to make the loops on this piece on the right, and probably the caps of the acorns on the left, is, if you do any beading, it's really similar to kumihimo braiding. But dresser sets where you might have one from your grandmother from the 50s or great grandmother from the 30s or 40s with a hairbrush and a mirror and a comb and a powder box. There would also be a hair collector. People customarily wore their hair long. Some people will say always, but I have photos indicating otherwise. Female people customarily wore their hair long. And brushing it and then putting it up, and then taking it down and brushing it and then putting it up tends to keep it in pretty good condition, so you could get these very long strands. Sometimes you'd use your own hair and make it for someone who was far away. There's a piece in the Victoria and Albert Museum that's a choker necklace made from 4 different shades of hair from 4 daughters that was made as a present for their mother. Sometimes you would also cut the hair from the deceased. Now, these are not actually mourning jewelry. They're just human hair jewelry. Again, you're looking for signals like the use of a lot of black in the design, the use of oak leaves, cedar, willow. But these, there's nothing to indicate with these that they're mourning pieces. Here's some scenery made entirely from human hair under glass. These definitely are mourning pieces because, again, we're seeing tombstones and then weeping willow here on the right. More examples. The very short hair in these probably were clipped from the deceased. This might be something you'd do to pass the time while you were sitting up with the body, or something you'd do for people who couldn't get there in time for the funeral. More examples. This on the lower left is a neat one because the hair is actually on the back. The front of the piece would be probably just a smooth circle of jet or onyx. So you're wearing the hair close to your heart when you pin it on. I think human hair jewelry is really cool. A lot of people find it gross, but I think it's kind of amazing. So I'm going to stop here for a second because we are about to look at some images of people that were taken after their deaths. If this is going to bother you, you are welcome to tap out now. The practice of postmortem photography was developed in order to make sure that you got one picture, because when photography was less common, especially if you'd lost a child, you might not have a picture yet. Also, if, for instance, your sister worked really, really hard making her wedding dress and now she's going to get buried in it, you then have a memory of her needlework visually. You might wear them as part of a piece of jewelry later in the era, but it was hard to develop them that small, and photos were fragile. The history of techniques used for photography is another subject, but it's fascinating. And this would also serve as perhaps a death announcement and could be provided to people who, again, couldn't make it for the funeral. So, still with me, we will have several images of dead people. There are some images of dead children toward the end, and at one point a dog. They're all very tasteful, and I will show you how to identify when an image is of a dead person. All right, ready to go? Here we go. This young lady is deceased. She is in her wedding dress, most likely. She's wearing a crown of orange blossoms, which were customarily worn by brides. She's quite young because her hair is down. All these things are indicators of social status and role that were developed in Victorian clothing. As you may have guessed from how complicated mourning clothes are, there's a lot of social dress code in this era. But you notice she's been posed very naturally, like she's asleep. This is pretty common because when you're memento moriing, remembering that death comes for us all, that shouldn't necessarily be a sad thing, right? This is a incredibly Christian dominated society, and much of public public discourse is driven by that. So, you know, this person is off in heaven, right? We shouldn't be too sad. Here's an example of the kind of equipment that makes it possible to take often fairly lifelike photos of dead people. These were also used on live people. This is an existing technology that gets repurposed in order to support the practice of Victorian mourning, which is serving all these social roles. The head clamps are in case you can't hold your head still for a full minute in order to have your picture taken. The time shortens, but it's not easy, and it's certainly not instant. The only way you can tell this gentleman is actually dead is because the rigor mortis has put his legs in such a weird position, because that wouldn't actually be an unusual way to have your picture taken. Now, this one is a live child. You can tell because the hands are moving. Babies will not sit still for pictures. Like, they can't. You cannot ask this of them. So I am sorry to tell you this, but if you're ever in an antique store and you find a lovely baby picture of a child who's sitting perfectly composed and the hands are very crisp, yeah, baby's dead. Here's a nice picture of a funeral arrangement. It's possible the body was not in great shape in this case, but you'll see there's a photo of her as part of the arrangement. Pictures of pictures very, very commonly indicate that they're a memorial photograph. In this case, we have a living family member standing alongside the departed. I find this image really lovely in its composition. Photos in the coffin. Interestingly, here in the South, this hangs on longer than actually posing people to be lifelike. It's not super uncommon for my students to tell me I actually have a photo of my great-grandfather in his coffin. We hold on to traditions like this a little longer in this region. So here's our first deceased baby, crisp hands. Probably the only photo that was taken of this child. So now the parents have a remembrance. This one of the girl with her dolls is the only one here that actually kind of freaks me out. Yeah. This one, the baby posed with the mirror, is beautiful and a very fine example of a way that that children were often posed in order to convey this discourse of innocence and that they're in a better place. But photographed with favorite playthings, not uncommon. Here's an interesting one. I can't tell if the child here is deceased or just asleep, but the person who's looking right at us is dead. Her eyes are open, but she's got one of those back braces on. And the way you can tell is, although they've posed her hands really naturally here, her hands are darker than her face. Blood tends to pool in the extremities after death. Knowing that, look here, and which of these women is dead? It's the one standing. Darker hands is usually the key. Which I guess she could just have really tanned hands if she wears a veil outside, but look how much her fingernails stand out. Again, notice the photograph. This is probably someone who couldn't make it to be in the picture. someone who died fairly shortly after her wedding again, or maybe a young widow from further south, but I don't think so because the unlit candle symbolically suggests someone who has not yet begun to live her life. This guy is also no longer with us. You can see just a little bit of the stand he's attached to. Again, surprising how natural he looks. This one of the puppy I kind of love. I will probably do this with my dogs when I lose them because I think that's lovely. So, as we look at all these, we see a way that technology is being used to create the notion that the afterlife is similar to this life, that there's a gentle, easy transition between them. And, you know, it might have felt that way as you were dying too, as you watched your family make those preparations, because you wouldn't go to a hospital. Hospitals were for poor people in this era. You would be cared for at home and you would die at home. By the way, this the draped mother and the baby, you do sometimes see these with everyone perfectly alive, but they wanted a picture of the baby specifically, so they threw a black sheet over the person holding the baby, which is terrifying looking. But yeah, these are the technologies that were used to cope with and signal what people needed around death and loss. So it's a fascinating example of ways that we can shape technologies to reflect social rituals and adapt existing technologies to make them suit our ethical and emotional relationship to such huge human realities as the experience of death and loss and dying. So I hope you have enjoyed this special spooky edition of STS 1010, and mourn well.